So today we'll be doing this passage, the two Chomskys. It's written by Chris Knight on Aeon. We'll link that passage down below. So Noam Chomsky rose to fame in the 1916, and even now in the 21st century, he is still considered one of the greatest intellectuals of all time. His prominence as a political analyst on the one hand and a theoretical linguist on the other simply has no parallel. What remains unclear is quite how the two sides of the great thinkers were connected up. When I first came across Chomsky's linguistic work, my reactions resembled those of an anthropologist attempting to fathom the beliefs of a previously uncontacted tribe. For anyone that for anyone in that position, the first rule is to put aside one's own cultural prejudices and assumptions in order to avoid dismissing every unfamiliar belief. So you don't want to go into doing that with some kind of pre-existing bias or notions, right? So you want to keep a clear head and clear understanding that the things I'm about to see or hear may be unfamiliar or either to unknown. The doctrines encountered seem unusual, but there are always compelling reasons why those particular doctrines are the ones people adhere to. The task of the anthropologist is to delve into a local context, history, politics, culture of the people under study, in the hope that this might shed light on the logic of those ideas. So, you don't want to get into stuff with preconceived notions and try to understand as much of the local context, history, and all that stuff to understand why this is logical for them. The tribe shaping Chomsky's linguistics, I quickly discovered, was a community of computer scientists during the early years of the Cold War, employed to enhance electronic systems of command and control for nuclear war and other military operations. My book, Decoding Chomsky, was an attempt to explain the ever changing intricacies of Chomsky's linguistics within this specific cultural and historical setting. I took it for granted the ideas people entertain are likely to be shaped by the kind of life they lead. In other words, I assumed that Chomsky's linguistic theories must have been influenced by the fact that he developed them while working for the US military, an institute he openly despised. So, we can see that Chomsky, although talked about was an anti-military activist, but his work in MIT, as we're gonna see in the passage further, his work he did in MIT for the military also shaped his very ideas, shaped his works and everything else. This was Chomsky's impossible dilemma. Somehow he needed to ensure that the research he was conducting for the military did not interfere with his conscience. So he despised the military but still worked for them. So this was a dilemma. And that he could criticize the US military without inducing them to cease funding his research. And the research he was doing was being funded by the military. So he needed to keep both the activism and his work going. His solution was to make sure that the two Chomskys, one working for the US military and the other against it, shared no common ground. He achieved this through a bold stroke of amputation. From the start of his academic career, no part of his scientific work would show up in his activism, while no trace of his activism would be detectable in his science. So he kept a clear difference between his activism and his professional work. Among the inevitable outcomes was a conception of language utterly divorced from what most of us mean by that term. So some of the byproducts of that division between the two characters. Language for Chomsky is a computational module restricted entirely to the individual and devoid of communicative, cultural, or social aspects. If it has any remaining purpose or function, it exists merely for talking to oneself. This novel and allegedly scientific model of language was so extreme in its individualism and abstraction that in the end it proved of no use to anyone, not even the military. So he had to come up with a very alien definition of what language is, and it did not come to any practical uses later in his life, right? Decoding Chomsky triggered a heated debate. Although reviewers were largely positive, Chomsky's own response was that the whole story is a wreck, complete nonsense throughout. In a letter to the London Review of Books in 17, he said that for anyone to suggest that the Pentagon once viewed his linguistics as important for future forms of war was too absurd. He also accused the author of spinning a web of deceit and misinformation. So these are just criticisms of the author's book, both by others and Chomsky. More recently, in an online interview with the physicist Lawrence Krauss, Chomsky suggested that those of us who raise the issue of his work for the Pentagon are just accusing him of working for the war machine. I concede that if that were my book's message, Chomsky's hostility would be easy to understand. But in fact, I am saying quite the different. Whether it's Chomsky or anyone else, we all need to make a living. In a world where money talks, we are often faced with harsh choice, compromise on a part of principle, or find ourselves out of work. One way or other, many of us have been there. To keep body and soul together, one version of ourselves colludes with the prevailing powers while other indignantly resists. So there must be a very clear cut distinction between the two parts of our characters, right? Like the dichotomy is very detailedly described in this passage. Chomsky found himself in such a situation. He had a PhD in linguistics but was unable to get a job at Harvard. So he went to see Jerome Wisner at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Wisner was a self-described military technologist who helped set up the Sandia nuclear weapons lab and was now the director of MIT's research laboratory of electronics. So there was a clear-cut involvement in war activities, right, by Wisner. He was impressed by Chomsky and gave him a job, but the young recruit had few illusions about where he worked. As he has confirmed in various interviews, MIT was 90% Pentagon funded, almost everybody was involved in defense research, and he himself was in a military lab. Chomsky was in no position to change any of this, but he could still avoid direct work on military technology. He refused to get security clearance and made no attempt to understand electronic devices, describing himself as a technophobe. So he wanted to clearly stay away from working on direct military technology and all that stuff. Of course, Chomsky had to do some work to keep his job. The solution he found was to confine himself to certain alleged yet previously unsuspected grammatical principles. So he was doing his work as a linguistic on the various languages, right? And what he was trying to achieve was very groundbreaking on the level of like discovering the DNA by Watson and Crick. He was trying to create a basic language which was very English-like, and we could communicate with computers, right? And so the generals or the people in war wouldn't have to learn programming or wouldn't have to learn any kind of specialized language to work with computers. They could just communicate with them as they were humans. So that was a very groundbreaking thing he was working on. With this courage sustained his MIT career for more than 6 decades. For anyone with Chomsky's powerful anti-militarist writings, it's astonishing to imagine that the US Department of Defense once considered his linguistic theories as a means to enhance their computerized systems of weapons, command and control. Their dream was that the commanders could type instructions in ordinary English instead of learning specialized computer languages. Astonishingly, certainly, such hopes were made quite clear by US Air Force scientists from that period. So some of the examples are given here. For example, Colonel Edmund Gaines referred to language research. We sponsored linguistic research in order to learn how to build command and control system that could understand English queries directly. Same by Colonel Anthony Gibbons as well. And Lieutenant J. Kaiser was a linguist recruited by Chomsky to MIT, who later became Chomsky's close friend and his boss as head of MIT's linguistics department. In articles from 1963 to 1965, Kaiser highlighted various problems with the artificial languages then being used in military's command and control systems. He recommended instead an English control language based on Chomsky's ideas that would enable commanders to use English when communicating with the weapon system. So the how they could be used in war machines and war stuff was very clearly established by the military, right? And Chomsky was working towards that goal. An Air Force sponsored offshoot MIT called the MIT RE Corporation was particularly interested in such ideas. MIT RE's linguists were led by former MIT researcher Donald Walker, who in 1969 explained, our linguistic inspiration was Chomsky's transformational approach. So there was clear military expectations from Chomsky's work. As many as 10 of Chomsky's students played key role in MIT's linguistic research, and in a report from 1962, Walker and his colleagues were quite clear. They intended to enhance the design and development of US Air Force. The original mission was to design systems for nuclear war, but by 1967, almost a quarter of corporation resources were focused on the Vietnam War. Its role in the war included overseeing technical side of the McNamara line. This was a massive high-tech project consisting of barriers of sensors, miners, cluster bombs across the border of North and South Vietnam, a barrier that was intended to finally crush the Vietnamese resistance. In light of all this, the one place that we might have expected to the fiercely anti-militarist Chomsky to avoid would be MIT-RE. So it was expected that Chomsky would avoid MIT-RE, but he didn't. So that's we are going to see further. But it appears that career pressures he faced at MIT meant that from 1963, Chomsky felt obliged to work directly for the corporation. We know this because two MIT research papers named Chomsky as a consultant, and both papers are quite clear that the research concerns the development of a program to establish natural language as an operational language for command and control. So he was involved in both of activism against the military, talking against the military, as well as working for it, right? We also from Chomsky's former students that he visited MITRE's laboratories on several occasions on this consultancy role. One of the students, Barbara Party, told me that Walker convinced his military to hire her and other military linguists on the basis that in the event of a nuclear war, the generals would be underground with some computers trying to manage things, and it would be easier to teach computers to understand English than to teach the generals to program. So, a justification of why we need to hire people for linguistic research. Party qualified her statement by saying that she is not sure anyone quite believed this justification, pointed out that basic research that might help military might also benefit wider society. But it's also true that the ability to communicate in English would give the US a very high military advantage. Consequently, Chomsky's students had tried to convince themselves that they were guilty of working with the military. So they always wanted to look at the natural and the pure science aspect rather than their applications in the war, right? One student, Haj Ross, even told me that he never had a whiff of military work at MIT-RE. But all this reminds me of the biologist Jonathan King's comments about the level of self-delusion among MIT students in 1980s. So this is the case of self-delusion where the scientists were actually working on the nuclear projects or the various weapons projects for the military, but they tried to believe in their own lives that they are not working towards wars and towards the war machines and contributing towards that such harmful causes, right? They are just working on science and trying to progress humanity. So delusion was common in these cases. In 1960s, MIT were the only specialist in nuclear war command and control who were interested in Chomsky's ideas. Researchers at the System Development Corporation were also trying to develop machines. So this was also something that was looked into in other corporations. Two machines that could understand English, and they were also paying very close attention to Chomsky's work and sometimes used Chomsky as a consultant. So Chomsky had quite a gravity in that field and was a respectable authority in that field. Fortunately, none of these military scientists managed to get Chomsky's theories to actually work. They did not produce the transformational grammar for military planning files, and the funding eventually stopped. So, they were not very good in working for the war, and it was not fruitful. The research was not fruitful, and the funding was stopped. Therefore, Chomsky still seems to regret this loss of funding, claiming that it came without strings attached. As he explained in his 2022 interview with Cross, the Pentagon was the best funder ever. They didn't care what you were doing. Nobody in the left can understand that. They assume that if you are working on problems of philosophy for the Defense Department, you must be working for the war machine. So the common misconception has been pointed out by Chomsky. Similar points were made in 2015 talk, where a couple of generals would sometimes visit his marketplace, but there wasn't much surveillance. Evidently, these generals were following the tradition of General Dwight Eisenhower, who in 1947 directed the military scientists must be given the greatest possible freedom to carry out their research. But the Chomsky's claim that the generals didn't care was uh, something very contrast to the documented evidence. It has been an anti-military that being an anti-militarist working in a military lab uh, was very difficult for Chomsky, right? But still, Chomsky had to work in a place that went against his beliefs, was contradicting his beliefs at all point. So while he has always known, as he said in a debate, that MIT was a major institution of war research, he also needs to believe that Pentagon was not funding war work. So this, so he needed to come to terms with two of these beliefs, right? That they can't coexist together. They are very worlds apart, right? Chomsky seemed equally conflicted when, in 2019, I raised the issue of his consultancy work for MIT RE. While he usually dismisses any suggestions that the military funded his linguistics, on this occasion he resorted to a quite different argument. MIT RE's linguists, he said, always understood that any imaginable military application would be far in the remote future. So, this seems like a case where he's trying to defend his work that he wasn't associated with the military. He said that any application of his work would be very far in the future and not applicable in current times. This sort of reasoning reassured Chomsky's students, but it is unlikely to have reassured Chomsky himself. Considering his response when his wife Carol began working on Air Force Project 1959, it enabled people to communicate with computers in natural language, one aim being to enhance military command and control systems. We have it from the project, said Bert Green, that Chomsky was very nervous about all this and needed reassurance that Carol wasn't working on voice activated command and control system. So he was very against war machines, and this sort of reasoning did not sit right with him, right? Because as is evident in his wife's case. So if Chomsky was nervous because of his wife's workplace, so he would have been even more nervous when he found himself working for MIT RE and the SDC, both of which were committing to design computer systems for use in the nuclear war. To appreciate quite how much this would have traveled Chomsky, we need to recall his response when he heard the news of the Hiroshima bombing. So his statement about when then knew about the news of the Hiroshima bombing confirms that he was troubled by all the work he was doing towards the military. Chomsky was similarly shocked when Philip Morrison, a scientist who had worked on the Hiroshima bomb, told him that he couldn't remember any discussion about the consequences of what he and his colleagues were doing until after the bomb had been used. These are some of the most brilliant human beings in the world, very human, European culture, high culture, not just engineers. They are so immersed in challenging technical problems of getting the thing to work that they are simply not considering the effects. So they are so much delving deep into the engineering and the technical aspects of it that they fail to think about what the effects could be. Chomsky was always dismayed at how brilliant people could go guiltlessly stoke up the possible of destroying the human race. He was also well aware of the role of MIT's managers in organizing and giving focus to such brilliance. So same thing. The MIT's vice president, General Max McCormack, supervised the university's Center for Communication Science, which included the linguistics department. Perhaps McCormack's interest in linguistics was purely intellectual, but I doubt it. He was the one who supervised creation of Pentagon's entire nuclear weapons stockpile. So the author is just mentioning all the involvement of the various MIT people in military aspects and military work. Same as Weisner. He became MIT's provost and president. He was essentially Chomsky's boss for more than 20 years. And the same thing, the author doubts that it was purely intellectual, his work, because he had a significant role in setting up the Pentagon's entire nuclear missile program, as well as the computerized air defense systems. By 1961, Weisner had become JFK's science advisor. According to one of his MIT colleagues, Weisner was well suited for the role as he was soaked in military work. So Weisner was actually very actively involved in military work, and by the mid 1960s, His air defense research at MIT had evolved into what Life magazine described as the backbone of the American field communications in Vietnam. Various laboratories in MIT continued to research helicopter design, radar, and other stuff. While Chomsky could sometimes ignore what was going on around him, he couldn't do this all the time. So there were many letters, very letters written in his own words. I have given a good bit of thought to resigning from MIT, which is more than any other university associated with activities of the Department of Defense, because the US military always show their work to the public as defense and rebuttal, right? But never actually what it does. Like the offensive part is never really shown. So why didn't Chomsky resign? Partly I suspect because MIT's managers were so impressed by his linguistic work that they had given him a professorship. They had isolated from the alumni and government pressures, and there was still a risk of prosecution and imprisonment for his anti-war activism, but there was no direct risk to his MIT career. So he was given very special treatment as a professor in MIT. The situation enabled Chomsky to throw himself into campaigning against the Pentagon while keeping his career intact. Among various motives for this shift into activism was undoubtedly a sense of guilt. So guilt was something working very strongly inside him, because he was working toward the same effect. As Chomsky told Ron, I won't pronounce his name, in 1992 he had reached a point by 1964 where it got so horrible over there that I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. So the guilt was strongly building up inside him. Of course, if Chomsky's linguistic theories had actually worked, if they had enhanced the Pentagon's ability to inflict death and destruction across the globe, there would be more reason to feel guilty, and it would have worsened Chomsky's or deepened Chomsky's determination to critique the US military. And Chomsky were particularly inspiring to MIT's more radical students, and by 1969 they had already pushed the university a major crisis over ongoing war research. As Chomsky did his best to resolve opposing student demands to simply end this research. So there was a huge demand for ending wartime research, right? And MIT had been pushed by the people, the students, and all of them into a crisis. He proposed that MIT should restrict him to a war research of purely defense and deterrent character. But everything is just an IVAS for the military, right? They market all of their activities as defensive and deterrent in nature, but in actuality it's not. The Department of Defense describes all its activities in the form of defense and deterrence. Indeed, Chomsky's position had sometimes similarities with that Weisner, who had become critical of both Vietnam War and nuclear arms race. Although Weisner's opinions never stopped him from continuing to administer a huge military research program at MIT, his liberalism did help create an atmosphere it was acceptable for MIT scientists to criticize the Pentagon. So it did not actually stop MIT from being involved in war research, but the environment was quite liberal indeed, because it allowed people to be critiquing the Pentagon and the war activities of the US military. Now perhaps Chomsky was content to do military research, secure in the knowledge that he could criticize the military, but the such wishful thinking couldn't have appeased Chomsky's conscience. Naturally, it seems to me more likely that his anxieties would be kept narrowing his focus to the more abstract, the otherworldly and beautiful yet unrealistic aspects of his linguistics, resisting any pressure to delve into the messy practicalities that he might have actually led to weapons. So this dichotomy of characters pushed Chomsky more towards the sought after beautiful aspect of nature, or the linguistics or the work he was doing, right, which was not always in sync with what the reality actually was. When the Pentagon funded basic research on MIT's campus, it was always in the hope that it might lead to development of actual weapons on off-campus labs. So there was a clear distinction between the basic research and the off-campus, but academics and students were always moving between the two. So there was also a form of illusion. So this illusion helped many MIT people comfort themselves, like they were not actively contributing towards the war, but in actuality what they were doing had a direct impact on the war research, right? MIT itself did not have any war-related work on campus. In fact, the only exception was the political science department. So Chomsky is on firm ground here in pointing that the military work of MIT's political and social scientists, some of whom advised US policymakers on counterinsurgency and the bombing campaigns in Vietnam. But to imply that MIT's natural scientists were also complicit is quite wrong, especially when we know that Weisner recruited 11 natural scientists from MIT to work on the McNamara line. So the author is debunking Chomsky's statements regarding that the scientists were not involved in working for the military. Chomsky must be aware of this, but he was determined to seize linguistics as a particularly pure form of natural science on a campus where this kind of science was considered, at least officially, free of military involvement. On a political level, this approach seems to have helped quieten Chomsky's conscience. On a scientific level, however, you can get only so far by conducting linguistics as if, like maths or physics, like a branch of natural science. So, to prove that the department was something free from the military control, Chomsky wanted to show that linguistics was a natural science like maths or physics, but this was something not very like this was not very true, right? So it's here to go to great lengths of explanation to show that why it was natural to him. Since language is intrinsically a social phenomenon, it simply cannot be understood this way. In the 40s and 50s, computing was new and exciting. It was tempting to explore the idea that there might exist in the human mind a computer-like device or mechanism that could account for our ability to speak. So various theories are developing as computing is the newer trend coming up. But from 1960s onwards, as this investigation kept failing, dissenters among Chomsky's supporters kept breaking away, insisting that historical, social, and cultural phenomena had to be brought back in. However, Chomsky refused to move even an inch in that direction. His justification that natural science is the only genuine kind of science, so-called social science being nothing more than reactionary ideology. So, Chomsky did not share the same views that it was a social phenomenon, language was a social phenomena. With this in mind, Chomsky made the striking claim that a rigorously natural science of language is realistic in view of the fact that language itself is not social at all. So, huge claims coming in from Chomsky to just prove his point. He was making such bold claims, having no significant function in terms of communication of thoughts or ideas. So, again, alien to us, he is just trying to justify his ways of thinking or his stances on various stuff, right? So he's just bringing out these alien ideas. In his book, he writes, language is not properly regarded as a system of communication, although it can, of course, be used for communication and as anything people do, manner of walking style, clothes, hair, etc. So, according to Chomsky, language could facilitate communication just like anything, like people's legs, clothes, hair, anything can be used for communication. So, very bold claims, right? Most readers of Aeon will assume that our capacity for language must have evolved among distant ancestors through natural selection. Understandable. Most will assume that language is not so much a system of thinking in private as it means of expressing our thoughts and sharing. You will probably take it that language is inseparably connected with social life and hence history, politics, and culture. True. You might also assume that although children are genetically equipped with necessary linguistic capacities, they are actually acquired their first language by learning from interacting with those around them. Chomsky, however, rejects each of these ideas to just prove his stance. For example, he said that the biological capacity for language did not evolve but appeared suddenly when the brain was rewired, perhaps by a slight mutation. So, very alien theory is being brought forward by him. From that moment, this mutant individual supposedly used language not to communicate with others but for silent thinking. The determination to free language from all connection with society, politics, history, or culture, all social connections, he wanted to maintain that language was not a social phenomenon, or rather natural to be studied, something to be studied naturally, hence giving birth to linguistics, which is a natural science according to him. All connection, in other words, the political activist side of his life is evident what drove him to these bizarre conclusions. It eventually drove him to the claim that words or the concepts behind them are lodged in the brain from birth, having become fixed in our genes at the moment when our first species emerged. So he thought that humans were preloaded with all these different languages, and it was a matter of activating that particular language to get the baby to speak the language we want, right? When challenged to explain how this idea could possibly apply to words such as bureaucrat and carburetor, things that clearly didn't exist when first human evolved, Chomsky held his ground. Like all lexical concepts, he insisted they must have genetically installed thousands of years before real bureaucrats or carburetors had been invented. So, like, we can see that the substance is very reducing, like substance is gradually reducing as he trying to defend his stance. When MIT's Jerry Fodor took Chomsky's side on this issue, his rival philosopher Daniel Dennett expressed astonishment. And he said, thus Aristotle had the concept of an airplane in his brain and also the concept of a bicycle. He just never had the occasion to use them. Perhaps Aristotle had an innate airplane concept, Dennett continued, but he did also have a concept of wide-bodied jumbo jet. Like, he's just trying to prove that Chomsky is like very mistaken in his take of it to trying to just prove his stance is correct. So these claims are very like not true. Despite the hilarity, Chomsky has continued to defend the idea. He embraces genetic determinism in an equally extreme form when discussing how a child acquires its first language. He claims that no child needs social learning to do this. Since all the world's languages have been genetically installed in each individual from birth, he says the child needs to run through its internal library of language and by process of elimination compute which particular one to activate. So he says that a baby, when it is born, has all the languages preloaded inside his brain, right? His or her brain, and exposure to language does not cause him to pick it up, but to reject or refuse to like speak or activate some other languages which are not the one he's being exposed to, right? So gradual exposure leads to activation of that particular language and he takes that up. It's pretty clear that a child approaches the problem of language by having all possible language in its head. It doesn't know which language is being exposed to, and the data comes along, mind automatically says, okay, it's not that language, it's some other language. Yet while championing such extreme genetic determinism, Chomsky has in recent years happily swung over to the opposite extreme, suggesting that the role of distinctively human genetics may be in fact zero. So again pivoting to a whole different stance. This would be the case if universal grammar turned out to be fundamental principle of language across universe. On this basis, bizarrely, Chomsky has since extended his claims to the languages of extraterrestrials, arguing that International Space Development Conference in 18 that universal grammar may prove to be universal not just among Earth dwellers but also in any planets in the other universes or in the same universe as well. In Rethinking Universality, Chomsky and his co-author Jeffrey Wartimel suggested that any language anywhere in the universe would resemble human language. Not only that, they and their co-author Ian Roberts go on to argue that universal grammar, that any intelligent extraterrestrials would likely be endowed with human-style linguistic software, thus eliminating any principal limit to effective communication. So bold claims by Chomsky and his co-authors and the people he was working with, and certainly no one could accuse Chomsky and supporters being cautious in their claims. The author mentioned at the outset of his job that his work as an anthropologist is not to describe Chomsky's strange ideas or find fault with them. It is to understand why he found it necessary to arrive at them. The only explanation that makes sense to me is that given his institutional situation in MIT, he felt obliged to follow two basic principles. Firstly, he would have to pursue natural science to prevent the political or the military or the wartime effects on his work, and second, to keep his natural science basic and pure, so to uncontaminated by the moral dangers of practical military applications. So the first one is to keep his science safe from being termed as social science or something that he didn't think linguistics was, and the second one is to prevent his work from being used in potential military applications. So even while continuing to admire Chomsky, most of his former supporters would now agree that when tested in the light of how language works, not one of his ever-changing theoretical approaches had survived the test of time. Their most fundamental flaw was always their abstraction, in particular their insulation from social engagement and the messy complexities of human life. So language or stuff is not which is insulated from society or the social engagements and people, culture, history, and all of that, right? It is related with the messy complexities of human life. In Explain Me This, the influential theoretical linguist Adele Goldberg makes the point that to study written sentences isolation, the Chomskyan strategy favored by the most theoretical linguists until recently may be akin to studying animals in separate cages in a zoo. While writing in 2016, the prominent evolutionary linguist and child psychologist Michael Tomasello and the development psychologist Paul Eberstein summed up that prevailing consistent by observing that Chomsky's universal grammar appears to have reached a final impasse. So, various examples of how the field is no more very practical and some critiques about it. Both of them are right. Not one of Chomsky's models of universal grammar has proved workable. Each new variant has turned out to be not more than out to be not just mistaken but fundamentally useless. The Pentagon's enthusiasm for AI has rekindled some interest in Chomskyan grammar for what they call future combat systems. There is no reason to believe that today's military linguists will be any more successful than their predecessors. So, it's very uncertain what will for the future of linguistics in military, right? Like whether they will prove to be useful for military or in other fields. But till now, they haven't. This raises an interesting question. If the entire Chomskyan paradigm was a mistake, then how can we explain its lasting influence? Even when they proved unworkable, Chomsky's theories retained their initial aura of promise and excitement as if some extraordinary breakthrough was about to be achieved. In the likening of his intended reconstruction of linguistics to the accomplishments of Descartes and Galileo, Chomsky raised himself to a plane far higher than any rival theoretician, offering hope for nothing less than a world-changing scientific revolution. So, he promised, or like his work was very promising, like, to the level of Descartes and Galileo even. So, that was a major reason for his like why he was such a decorated and was such an authority in that field. In the early days, transformational grammar's apparent endorsement by the Pentagon played a decisive public relations role. So, as the field was being endorsed by Pentagon, it was very popular, and it also provided very high popularity to even Chomsky himself. Previously, a linguist would most likely be some kind of anthropologist making notes about language spoken in some marginalized community or little known tribe. The prospect of such a scholar enjoying funding from the military would have seemed absurd. Chomsky's arrival changed everything. Few people knew precisely why Pentagon was so interested in his thinking, but the fact that they seemed interested did his institutional status no harm. But there is more to it than that. The author's suspicion is that Chomsky's institutional milieu, his ideas that just had to be true. Endorsing Chomsky meant endorsing his picture of language as a digital computational device. To any computer scientist, that was an attractive idea. So he provided visions into what what language could be, right? So, and those were very popular among his colleagues and possible people in the application regions like war, military, etc. Chomsky's program promised to elevate the generation of military-sponsored computer scientists to the status of not merely electronics engineers but philosophers. In the tradition of Plato or Descartes, geniuses delving into the greatest of all mysteries, the ultimate nature of human language and mind. Right or wrong, it was clearly too attractive a vision to be slightly set aside. Even to this, despite decades of disappointment and failure, the vision still enjoys passionate support. So it was just too good a vision to be cast aside, right? And even today, there is a lot of passion towards that vision. For anyone in my position as an admirer of Chomsky's political activism, it feels risky to say things that can be so easily misunderstood. No part of my account can detract from Chomsky's unparalleled record as an activist, neither can it detract from his persistence in putting up with the pressures and contradictions that inevitably came with a career at MIT. So he has a stellar activist record with working or critiquing or working against the US military, right? And the author respects him for it. Many of Chomsky's activist supporters have been shocked to discover that hero has been on friendly terms with the former head of CIA, also with the sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. But it would have been impossible for Chomsky to maintain his position for MIT without associating with the top dogs, as it's understandable. As Chomsky told the Harvard Crimson of his meetings with Epstein, I've met all sorts of people, including major war criminals. I don't regret having met any of them. For me, Chomsky's association with Epstein was a serious error. I also believe that had Chomsky been so principled and pure as to refuse working at the MIT, then he might have never gained the platform he needed to inspire so many of us to work oppose both militarism and even the greater threat of climate catastrophe. So, if Chomsky was not so popular and hadn't made all those people, hadn't worked at MIT, the things he brought to light, the criticism against the military, criticism in the climate catastrophe, wouldn't have come to light, right? We wouldn't have come to know about them in such greater detail. But so the author is actually praising Chomsky's activism record in this paragraph. There are times where we have all to make certain compromises, some more costly than others. In Chomsky's case, it was his attempt at a new understanding of language that suffered most from the institutional contradictions he faced. Despite the failure of his attempted revolution in linguistics, Chomsky's political activism remains an inspiration. So the concluding paragraph sums up the entire paragraph, and so it was a great paragraph on the duality of the character of Chomsky, right? Whether he was a computer scientist working in the field of linguistics, unbeknownst to him, he was helping the military sometimes, and on the other hand, he was an activist working against the military and also the climate at sometimes. So the author has tried to bring out the. It feels sometimes that the author is trying to bring out the hypocrite part of Chomsky himself, telling that he was not the best. Like his workplace was not the best. He had sometimes had to compromise his principles to work towards his field, and had to come up with alien theories to justify his working. You can also go through the comments, and like there are certain various comments that are going against what the author is telling. So yeah, it was a great passage. Thanks.